I'm Jareth Kopis, and this is Notes from Underground. Today we're going to be continuing our conversation about Belarus and the events unfolding there. We left our last show with a question. That question being, why were veterans who had specifically fought in support of the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics against the Fascist Ukrainian army targeted for recruitment by a mysterious Sergei Petrovich? Last week we spoke about the history of Belarus, in particular its lack of an anti-Soviet or ultra-nationalistic population. Often these populations are used by the West to help gain control of the former Soviet bloc nations. This has become quite the media topic for a lot of the typical Western outlets, the Atlantic Council, and this article in the Kiev Post talk about it specifically. Let's take a really close look at that article in the Kiev Post. And I quote, "Committed protesters do arrive each evening en masse, but there is no Maidan-style tent city, and they do not bother to occupy territory." This is a journalist complaining that protests are too peaceful, that they have not gone far enough as illegally occupying buildings, as they did in Ukraine, this ultimately leading to death, violence, civil war, destruction, and subjugation of an entire country. Well, I guess that is the goal of the Atlantic Council and its mouthpieces like the Kiev Post, so why try to hide it anymore? Vladislav continues with, "The protests are generally very sweet, polite, and peaceful. Many are young, middle-class Belarusians who work in the country's booming IT industry and come to rallies dressed in form-fitting hipster ensembles. Unlike events in Kiev in 2013 and 14, there is no militant edge to the demonstrations. Indeed, this revolution is so velvet that at times it feels positively sleepy. For better or worse, there is a marked absence of the rough and stalwart young men capable of making liberals uncomfortable or leading the resistance if and when the authoritarian state decides to deploy force." Rough, stalwart young men capable of making liberals uncomfortable, whom should be leading this resistance like those in Kiev during Maidan. Again, this journalist, Vladislav Davidzon, is pining for the good old days in Kiev when groups of Western-backed neo-Nazis burned people alive like they did in Odessa. This video I'm about to show you is explicit, but it's very important that you see what these stalwart young men capable of making liberals uncomfortable did in Ukraine, and what the Atlantic Council and Mr. Davidzon need to be called out for their promotion of these atrocities. This needs to come to an end, and I'm calling them out. Again, I apologize for the explicit video, but it's very important for people to see what this man, what Davidzon is calling for, what he is looking for this protest to turn into. He's worried that without these fascist thugs performing false flag massacres like they did on Maidan when protest leaders staged the sniper attacks that killed 100 innocent people, that it'll flame out and the Belarusian president won't be removed in favor of a Western-backed one. This is what organizations seek for Belarus. This is what the Atlantic Council wants. This is what they push for. And this is what they see as the best democratic way for Belarus to be headed. For me personally, I hope the so-called revolution in Belarus remains velvet and becomes even more so, and that Belarus does not meet the same fate that Ukraine is still suffering from today. And I personally demand that Davidzon either clarify why he is in support of this type of action, or he remove his article. That does nothing but incite more violence and death. That's right, Davidzon. Let's get some answers from you. It's time to be truthful. Why are you supporting this type of action? That being said, let's continue. So Belarus is currently in the crosshairs of yet another color revolution attempt. This revolution set into action when traditionally stable ties between Russia and Belarus began deteriorating, and the door was opened by Lukashenko for the West, which they happily are now barging through. This revolution appears to have started with the arrest of 30 Russians in Minsk. These Russians were being portrayed as assassins who were attempting to kill Lukashenko. But the facts are now again showing, and that narrative is far from the truth. These men were contacted by a mysterious super soldier and recruiter for the PMC Wagner, Sergei Petrovich. He had been calling them from a number registered in Syria, but it was actually a fake virtual number, not registered to any cellular network. An actual location can't be determined, and only allowed for outgoing calls. This Sergei Petrovich took a specific liking to veterans of the war in Donbass, and stated that he was hiring people to work security for oil facilities in Syria. One of these men contacted has already come out to speak out against the situation. Artem Milyayev, who went by the call sign Shaman while defending Donbass from fascists, stated that he had been so impressed with Sergei Petrovich and his backstory that he offered not only to join Petrovich, but also to help him get recruits for more members of this group. Milyayev was convinced that Sergei Petrovich was the real deal when he was introduced over the phone to the Rosneft security manager, Sergei Viktorovich Bezinsky. So Bezinsky joined Milyayev and Petrovich in negotiations and planning for the group. Milyayev corresponded with Bezinsky over email to the address info@officerosneft.org, which we now know was never registered in Russia and stopped working 2 days after the arrest of the group in Minsk. Not only that, but there were no records of a Sergei Viktorovich Bezinsky on staff of Rosneft either. Milyayev set to work gathering old comrades who he had fought alongside in Donbass and did his best to meet the quota of 90 people set forth by the customer. This number then increased to 180 after some time, and Milyayev was provided with this new quote by Bezinsky. So Milyayev then continued to gather more and more people, and he met the quota. He sent the information, photos, even banking credentials, addresses, and other pertinent information that was requested by Bezinsky. Not only that, they had a fake questionnaire that they were to fill out and return to Bezinsky himself. As Milyayev continued his recruitment, he was suddenly notified by Bezinsky that the heroic Sergei Petrovich had died in Libya. Later that week, a new handler contacted Milyayev. This time it was from a Venezuelan phone number. So this number, like the one from Syria, has now been verified to be a virtual number. And it's actually the number of a consular department of the Russian embassy in Caracas. The number of an actual duty officer. But the thing is that this phone cannot make outgoing international calls. So what is easily done is you make these virtual numbers and you can select any number you wish. That's like cyber calls you get, political calls you get, fake calls you get all the time on your cell phone. They were just doing it on a much grander scale. This new handler instructed Milyayev to move forward with the 180 men, splitting them into 5 groups, each with its own commander. 4 of these were to be transported to Minsk, and the 5th would be going to Venezuela. In the first group going to Minsk, nearly all of them had once held Ukrainian citizenship, and all had fought against the fascists in Donbass. Milyayev received the tickets for the group's transport. The tickets appeared to have been purchased in Moscow, but once it was investigated, it was determined to have been bought through a new Ukrainian travel agency from an agent in Lviv, Ukraine. The second group's tickets were purchased in the same manner via a shady, brand new travel company based in none other than Ukraine. Not only this, but once the tickets were in the hands of Milyayev and the other commanders, the itinerary had been canceled and rebooked. The reservations for most had been canceled as well, so they completely shut down the entire operation once the gentlemen had tickets in hand, but didn't inform them that it had all been canceled. The first group arrived in Belarus with their fresh contracts in hand. These contracts were written to them through Rosneft, and all the men had signed these thinking they were legally contracted by Rosneft and other organizations that had hired them for security. What we know now is that these documents are complete fakes. They were then escorted by a Belarusian citizen, Gennady Kompan, the only real person the group met. Even the woman in charge of setting up the travel accommodations for the groups appears to be fake as well. After the group's arrival, this woman, Larissa, made Milyayev aware that the next flight they scheduled had been canceled, and that they were to leave on another plane, and that all the members were to burn or destroy their tickets, which they did. These tickets would have led investigators straight back to Lviv and Kiev, which now, through the information obtained, the parties involved has been discovered anyways. The men happily came forward since we have seen now they were arrested on July 29th and their supposed employers have disappeared and left them out to dry. When the other group saw what was happening, they reached out to Larissa, who had suddenly disappeared as well. After the men in the first group were arrested, their information was sent almost immediately to the Ukrainian embassy. We know that it was sent almost immediately because of the fact that the Ukrainian hit list website Mirtvorets had posted solid information on 12 of the members, and 16 others were named as well. This was before it even had hit the media. So let's sum this all up. The Ukrainian SBU thought it was going to be in the clear, that this very intricate plan involving over 100 Russian citizens concocted to further divide Belarus and Russia, creating a rift that would never be repaired, never repaired because the West had set into action the removal of the only person who could stop this permanent split, Lukashenko. The West, through the SBU, imagined it would be easily enough to pin all of this on the now infamous Wagner Group, much utilized in the West as a boogeyman already. Not only that, but they were also pinning it on the Russian oil company Rosneft by tying them into the entire ordeal with fake emails and documents. It's no surprise that Ukraine immediately sought the extradition of these prisoners in order to keep this info from getting out. What the West didn't expect was that, again, Lukashenko, somehow, perhaps through dumb luck or perhaps through cunning, has doubled down and seems to be resisting the Western attempts to once again topple the last European dictator. And to answer last week's question, why were these men who had fought alongside the republics in the war in Donbass specifically targeted? Well, that's clear. Ukraine, the SBU, was behind this, and they wanted these men arrested and extradited back to Ukraine. And that's where we are going to end today. And I'm going to leave you with multiple questions this time, and I want to hear your voice. So now that you've been presented with the factual version of how this revolution began in Belarus, that it was intricately planned and organized, how do you think it can be stopped? There are clear issues inside Belarus, just like in any nation. Their president is obviously a flawed man, but who isn't? How should it end? In blood or in compromise? And lastly, after seeing just one of the now countless atrocities performed by the Ukrainian Nazis, are you going to idly sit by while men, and I use the term very loosely, like Vladislav Davidzon, are not only idolizing these murderers, but calling for them to rise in another country? We are all responsible to fight this, and it's time to choose your side before it's chosen for you. This has been Notes from Underground, and I'm Jareth Kopis.